The silence was not the kind that brought peace. It was the kind that made the bravest soldiers in the galaxy stop walking, hold their breath, and listen with every genetic modification their ancestors had paid for. The forest of Vorax stretched across the northern hemisphere of a world that had no proper name in any imperial database, only a hazard classification and a standing order to avoid atmospheric entry unless absolutely necessary. The trees grew tall and black, their bark smooth as polished obsidian, their branches interlocking so tightly that even at midday the forest floor existed in a permanent twilight. The ground was soft and wet, full of hidden things that moved when you stepped too close. The air smelled of decay and something else, something metallic and ancient, like the inside of a wound that had never fully healed. The alien soldiers who occasionally ventured to the Yuan of this place never stayed long. Their command units had learned through bitter experience that Vorax did not forgive mistakes. Patrols that entered the tree line with full sensor suites and heavy plasma cannons often returned with fewer numbers, their eyes wide, their reports fragmented and incomplete. Some spoke of creatures that moved without sound, predators that struck from above or below or anywhere except where the scanners were pointing. Others spoke of something worse, something that did not appear on any thermal readout or motion tracker, something that left no tracks but always seemed to be watching from just beyond visual range. The Imperial Archives contained exactly one file on the entity that lived at the heart of that darkness. The file had no image, no confirmed biometric data, no known origin point. It had only a designation typed in cold administrative text. The human in the Forbidden Forest. No one knew how he had gotten there. Some theorists suggested he was the abandoned remnant of a failed deep space expedition from a minor fringe species, left behind when his ship malfunctioned, and his commanders decided the rescue cost exceeded the asset value. Others whispered darker possibilities, that he had been born there, gestated by the forest itself, a native organism wearing the shape of something that should not exist on this world. The truth was lost. But one thing was clear. He survived. The alien military outpost stationed 300 kilometers south of the forest boundary had learned to accept his existence as a permanent anomaly. They did not attempt contact. They did not send recovery teams. They launched surveillance drones at irregular intervals, watched the telemetry feeds for as long as the signals lasted, and then filed the reports in a folder marked with the highest classification clearance. The drones never came back. Most of them stopped transmitting within minutes of crossing the tree line. But the fragments of data that did make it through painted a picture that the officers read in private late at night when no one else was watching. The human had no armor, no plasma weapon, no light-based technology of any kind. He did not carry a communication device, a med kit, a ration pack, or any of the other standard survival tools that even the most primitive species learned to manufacture. His clothing consisted of treated animal leather, stitched together with cordage made from plant fiber, worn thin at the joints and stained dark with old blood that was not his own. His body was lean, corded with muscle that moved under the skin like cables under pressure, every motion economical and precise. He carried scars on his arms, his chest, his face, a map of old violence written in pale lines across sun-darkened flesh. The surveillance footage that survived showed him doing things that made no sense to the analysts who reviewed it. They watched him walk through terrain that would have torn the legs off a military walker, his bare feet finding purchase on surfaces that should have been impossible to grip. They watched him climb the black trees without sound, ascending vertical trunks using nothing but the strength of his fingers and the positioning of his toes. moving through the canopy like a shadow cast by something that had no body. They watched him track prey across distances that would have required satellite support for any Imperial hunter, following broken twigs and displaced moss and faint disturbances in the air that his nose somehow detected, despite the overwhelming chemical soup of the forest. But the footage that haunted them most showed him standing over the body of a creature he had killed. The beast was 3 times his mass, a predator native to Vorax that the Imperial biologists had classified as an apex threat, equipped with claws that could shear through light armor and a bite force that could crush the cockpit of a reconnaissance vehicle. The human had no weapon that the cameras could identify. He had simply walked into the creature's ambush, stood perfectly still while it charged, and then moved. The motion was too fast for the drone's frame rate to capture clearly. What the analysts saw was a blur, a shift in position that should not have been possible given the biomechanics of the human form, and then the beast was on the ground with a bone blade embedded in the soft tissue beneath its jaw. The human had made the knife himself, the analysts confirmed after magnifying the image. It was carved from the femur of some larger animal, sharpened to an edge that could sever arteries through fur and muscle and fat. He had carried it without ever once drawing attention to it, without ever adjusting his posture or changing his gait to accommodate its presence. The weapon was an extension of his body, as natural as his own hand. The human did not celebrate the kill. He did not raise his arms in triumph or vocalize his dominance. He stood over the beast for a long moment, his chest rising and falling in slow, controlled breaths, and then he knelt and placed both palms flat against the creature's skull. He closed its eyes with his thumbs, a gesture so gentle and deliberate that the analysts watched it 3 times before they believed what they were seeing. Then he worked. He removed the bone knife from the wound, cleaned it on the beast's own fur, and cut away a single section of meat from the hind flank. He left the rest of the carcass intact, stepping back and waiting until the first scavengers appeared at the edge of the clearing before he turned and walked away. The analysts filed their reports. The commanders read them in silence. And somewhere in the deep black trees, the human continued his patrol. Varela of House Telnikar had been tracking sentient beings since she was old enough to hold a blade. Her family was ancient, one of the 12 noble houses that had ruled the empire for 30 generations, their bloodline refined through centuries of selective breeding and genetic optimization. She had been engineered for warfare, her musculature denser than baseline, her nervous system calibrated for reaction times that approached the theoretical minimum for carbon-based life. Her eyes could see in complete darkness. Her ears could distinguish individual footsteps in a crowd of thousands, and her nose could follow a chemical trail across 50 kilometers of open terrain. She was, by any objective measure, one of the most dangerous predators in Imperial space. She had come to Vorax expecting to find a curiosity, a feral animal wearing human skin, a specimen to be observed and catalogued, and then removed for study. The briefing she had received from Imperial Command contained the standard warnings about environmental hazards and the unknown threat profile of the target. But Varela had read those warnings before. She had tracked rogue bioweapons across radiation-blasted wastelands. She had hunted insurgent commanders through methane swamps that would dissolve standard filtration systems in minutes. She had never encountered a target that her skills could not handle. The forest changed her mind within the first hour. The darkness was absolute. Even her enhanced vision struggled to pierce the layers of canopy overhead, the light filtering down in thin, pale streaks that illuminated nothing and everything at once. The ground squelched under her boots. releasing smells that her training told her to ignore but her instincts refused to accept. Something moved in the undergrowth to her left, fast and low, gone before she could turn her head. Something else called out from the canopy above, a sound like metal scraping against metal, rhythmic and patient and completely unlike any vocalization in the Imperial database. She had activated her cloaking field before entering the tree line, the latest generation of active camouflage technology that bent light and sound and even thermal radiation around her body. The device was expensive, power-hungry, and classified at a level that required personal authorization from a house elder to carry. It had never failed her before. But as she moved deeper into the forest, she found herself checking the status display more frequently than protocol recommended, watching the power levels drain, listening for the telltale hum that would indicate a malfunction at the worst possible moment. The human's trail was easy to find and impossible to follow. He left footprints, shallow impressions in the soft ground, but they wandered without purpose, doubling back on themselves, stopping at random intervals and then resuming in entirely different directions. He climbed trees and descended on the opposite side. He walked through streams that should have washed away any trace of his passage. He left markers that Varela recognized as intentional misdirection. Broken branches placed at eye level to draw attention away from the ground. Disturbed leaves arranged to suggest movement in one direction, while the true path curved silently in another. She realized after 3 hours that she was not following him. He was leading her. Every trail she found, every sign she interpreted, every decision she made about which direction to go came from a pattern he had laid down hours or days earlier. She was moving through a maze designed specifically for her, and she had no way of knowing whether the exit led to him or to a pit full of spikes or to nothing at all. She should have turned back. Every tactical protocol in her training screamed at her to abort the mission, return to the outpost, and request orbital surveillance. But Varela had not risen to her position by following protocols when her instincts told her to do something else. She kept moving, deeper into the black trees, until the light faded to nothing, and the sounds of the forest changed into something that felt almost like speech. She found him at the edge of a clearing, just before midnight by her internal chronometer. He was sitting with his back against a tree trunk, his eyes closed, his breathing so slow and shallow that she almost missed it entirely. He looked smaller than she had expected, less imposing than the drone footage had suggested. His hair was dark and matted, his beard uneven, his skin marked with old scars and new bruises. He held no weapon. His hands rested on his thighs, palms up, fingers loose. He looked almost peaceful. Varela stayed in the canopy for 2 hours, watching him not move. Her cloaking field held, the power supply dropping from 80% to 60 to 40, and still she watched. She studied the way his chest rose and fell, the micro-adjustments of his posture as his weight shifted against the bark, the way his fingers twitched occasionally as if responding to sounds she could not hear. She noted the absence of any visible technology, any tool or weapon or survival equipment beyond the leather clothes on his back and the bone knife she could see tucked into a sheath at his hip. She was beginning to wonder if the analysts had exaggerated his capabilities when he opened his eyes. He did not look at her. He looked at the tree branch to her left, the one she had tested for stability before committing her weight to it. He looked at the patch of moss on the trunk below her feet, the one she had disturbed when she climbed past it. He looked at the place where her cloaking field bent the starlight at an angle that did not quite match the natural environment. He looked at all of these things in sequence, his head turning slowly, his eyes tracking across the darkness with an intensity that made her breath catch in her throat. And then he smiled. Just a small movement of the muscles around his mouth, barely visible in the dim light. There and gone in less than a second. He stood up, stretched his arms above his head, and walked into the deeper darkness without looking back. Varela stayed in the tree until her cloaking field dropped below 10%, and the warning light began flashing against her retina. She climbed down on shaking legs, her hands slipping on the bark, her mind racing through possibilities that all ended in the same conclusion. He had known she was there. He had known from the beginning, from the first moment she crossed the tree line, maybe from the first moment she entered the forest at all. He had let her follow him. He had led her to that clearing, arranged himself in that pose, closed his eyes and slowed his breathing and waited for her to find him. And then he had shown her exactly what he wanted her to see. The question that kept her awake through the rest of the night was simple and terrible. What had she not seen? She abandoned the mission profile on the second day, not because command ordered her to, but because she realized that the standard approach would never work. The human was not an animal to be tracked or a target to be acquired. He was something else entirely, something her training had not prepared her for, something that required a different kind of attention. She stripped off her power armor first, piling the pieces in a clearing and covering them with branches and dead leaves. The armor was hot and heavy and loud, its servo motors humming constantly, its joints clicking with every movement. She had not realized how much noise it made until she took it off and heard the forest for the first time. The sounds were overwhelming, a symphony of clicks and whistles and low-frequency rumbles that she had been filtering out automatically, dismissing as irrelevant background noise. Without the armor's acoustic dampeners, she heard everything. She removed her plasma weapon next, a standard-issue sidearm that had saved her life on 3 separate deployments. The weapon was warm in her hands, its power cell still at 97%, its targeting systems calibrated and ready. She set it down next to the armor and did not look back. The bone knife she kept, a simple tool of no technological significance, its edge sharp enough to cut flesh but useless against anything armored or mechanical. It felt almost weightless compared to the plasma weapon, almost harmless. She covered her skin with mud from the stream bed, rubbing the cold clay into her arms and face and neck until her natural blue coloration disappeared beneath a layer of brown and gray. She wetted her hair and pressed it flat against her scalp. She removed her boots and walked barefoot, feeling the ground directly, sensing the vibrations of approaching creatures through the soles of her feet. She slowed her breathing, controlled her heart rate, and became part of the forest. The first day without technology was the hardest. Her feet bled from cuts she did not remember receiving. Her skin itched where the mud dried and cracked. Her stomach cramped from hunger. The ration bars she had left behind, replaced by berries she hoped were not poisonous, and water she drank from streams without any way to test its purity. She lost track of the human twice, spending hours circling back to find his trail again, reading signs that she had dismissed before as meaningless. A broken twig here, a displaced stone there. A pattern in the moss that suggested something heavy had passed this way, moving slow and careful, leaving almost no trace of its passage. On the second night, she found his campsite again. This time she did not hide in the canopy. She stayed on the ground, 50 meters away, her back against a tree, her eyes fixed on the distant glow of his fire. She watched him process a small animal, skinning it with quick, efficient movements, cutting the meat into strips and laying them over hot stones to cook. He worked in silence, his face blank, his hands moving with a precision that spoke of years of practice. When the meat was done, he ate half of it and left the other half on a flat rock at the edge of the clearing. Varela waited until he had moved away from the fire before she approached the rock. The meat was still warm, the fat still glistening. She picked it up with both hands, held it to her nose, smelled nothing dangerous, and ate it in 3 bites. It was the best thing she had ever tasted. She stayed at the edge of the clearing for the rest of the night, watching the fire burn down to embers, watching the human sleep with his back against a tree and his knife in his hand. She did not try to approach him. She did not try to speak. She simply watched and waited, learning the rhythm of his breathing, the pattern of his movements, the way he checked the perimeter every time he woke from sleep. He was always watching, always listening, always aware, and he never once looked in her direction. On the 3rd morning, she found the drawing. It was scratched into the soft bark of a tree trunk at eye level, a simple charcoal sketch of 2 figures standing side by side. One was clearly human, with broad shoulders and a thick beard and scars on its chest. The other was smaller, slimmer, with a ridge along its brow and markings on its arms that matched Varela's own genetic heritage. They were not touching. They were not facing each other. They were simply standing together, facing the same direction, looking out at something that the sketch did not show. Varela touched the drawing with her fingertips, feeling the grooves where the charcoal had been pressed into the bark. The image was fresh, drawn within the last few hours, while she had been sleeping. He had come close enough to see her, close enough to study her features and reproduce them in charcoal, and she had not woken up. She had not heard him. She had not smelled him. She had not felt the vibrations of his footsteps through the ground. She should have been afraid. Instead, she felt something else, something she did not have a name for. A kind of recognition, maybe. A kind of understanding. The human was not hiding from her. He was showing her what he wanted her to see, just as he had done from the beginning. And what he wanted her to see, what he had been trying to communicate through every broken trail and displaced stone and shared meal, was that he was not her enemy. She left the drawing where it was and continued deeper into the forest. The hexapod attacked on the 4th day. Varela did not see it coming. One moment she was crouched by the stream, washing the mud from her arms, watching the human 50 meters downstream doing the same thing. The next moment the air was full of wings and claws and a sound like tearing metal, and something hit her from behind with enough force to drive her face first into the water. She rolled, came up with her knife in her hand, and saw the creature for the first time. It was massive, easily 2 meters from head to tail, with 6 legs ending in curved talons and a mouth full of needle teeth arranged in concentric circles. Its wings were leathery and torn, its eyes black and empty, its body covered in scars that spoke of a long and violent life. It had been hunting her. It had been tracking her for hours, maybe days, waiting for the moment when her attention would lapse and she would become prey. The creature lunged again, and Varela threw herself sideways, feeling the wind of its passage against her face. She slashed with her knife, opening a shallow wound along its flank, but the blade barely penetrated the thick hide. The creature landed, turned, and lunged again, faster this time, its talons reaching for her throat. She did not have time to dodge. She did not have time to block. She had time only to realize that she was about to die, and then the human was there. He moved faster than anything she had ever seen. One moment he was 50 meters downstream, washing blood from his hands. The next moment he was between her and the creature, his body low to the ground, his bone knife extended in a grip that looked almost casual. The creature's talons scraped across his shoulder, drawing blood, but he did not flinch. He stepped inside its reach, drove the knife up under its jaw, and twisted. The creature collapsed. The human stepped back, pulling his knife free, and watched as the hexapod twitched and bled and finally lay still. His shoulder was bleeding freely, the cuts deep enough to show white beneath the red, but he did not seem to notice. He was looking at Varela, his head tilted slightly, his expression unreadable. She opened her mouth to speak, to thank him, to say anything at all, and then she realized that she had no idea what language to use. Imperial Standard was the lingua franca of the Empire, spoken by every civilized species from the core worlds to the outer reaches. But the human was not from the Empire. He was from somewhere else, somewhere far away, somewhere that the Empire's influence had never reached. He might not understand a single word she said. She settled for touching her chest and saying her name, Varela. The human looked at her for a long moment. His eyes were dark and deep, shadowed by something that might have been exhaustion or grief or simply the weight of too many years alone. He did not speak. He did not touch his chest or offer a name in return. He simply nodded once and then turned and walked back to the stream to wash the hexapod's blood from his hands. Varela followed him. She sat on the bank while he worked, watching the water turn pink and then clear. She studied the way he moved, the economy of motion, the complete absence of wasted effort. Every gesture had a purpose. Every position of his body had a tactical justification. He was never relaxed, never off guard, never anything less than fully present in the moment. Even now, with the immediate threat eliminated, his eyes tracked across the tree line every few seconds, checking for movement, assessing the environment, maintaining a constant awareness that Varela found exhausting just to observe. He finished cleaning his hands and his knife and stood up. He looked at her again, that same unreadable expression, and then he gestured with his head toward the deeper forest. An invitation or a command, she could not tell which. She stood up and followed. They walked for an hour in silence, moving through terrain that would have been impassable for anyone without the human's instincts or Varela's training. He led her to a small cave, its entrance hidden behind a curtain of hanging vines, its interior dry and surprisingly warm. There was a fire pit in the center, already laid with kindling, and a pile of dried moss that looked like it had been arranged as a bed. He had been here before. He had prepared this place in advance, maybe for himself, maybe for someone else, maybe just because preparation was as natural to him as breathing. He knelt by the fire pit and struck 2 stones together, producing a shower of sparks that caught the kindling on the 3rd attempt. The flames grew slowly, casting dancing shadows on the cave walls. He sat back on his heels and looked at her again. That same patient, waiting expression, and Varela realized that he was giving her a choice. She could stay or she could leave. She could speak or she could remain silent. He would accept whatever she decided, and he would not force the issue either way. She sat down across the fire from him and tried to think of something to say. The fire crackled between them, sending sparks up into the darkness of the cave ceiling. Varela watched the human's face in the shifting light, studying the lines around his eyes and mouth, the way the flames reflected in his dark irises. He was younger than she had expected, she realized. The scars and the beard and the weariness made him look older, but there was something in the set of his jaw, the smoothness of his skin where the scars did not reach, that suggested he had not yet seen his third decade. Young to be so alone, young to carry so much weight. She tried again to speak, forming the words slowly, hoping that something in her tone or her expression would convey meaning even if the specific sounds did not. Who are you? Where did you come from? How did you end up here, alone in this place, fighting creatures that would kill a normal person in seconds? The human watched her mouth move, watched her hands gesture, watched her eyes search his face for any sign of understanding. His expression did not change, but something shifted in his posture, a subtle relaxation of his shoulders, a slight tilt of his head. He reached out and picked up a stick from the edge of the fire, its tip charred black from the flames. He held it up so she could see, and then he turned to a clear patch of dirt beside the fire and began to draw. The first image was simple, a circle with lines radiating outward, like a child's drawing of the sun. But the lines were not even, not regular. Some were long, some short, some thick, some thin. They reminded Varela of something she had seen before, something from the Imperial archives, a diagram of something vast and complex. The human added more lines, connecting the first set, building a pattern that slowly resolved into something recognizable. A solar system, a star with planets in orbit around it, their paths traced in charcoal on the cave floor. He drew 9 planets, then paused, erased one with the heel of his hand, and drew it again in a different position. He was correcting himself, Varela realized. He was drawing from memory, trying to reproduce something he had not seen in a long time. He pointed to the 3rd planet from the star. He tapped it twice with the end of the stick, then looked up at her. Varela felt her heart stop. That was Earth. That was the human homeworld, the planet that Imperial scouts had discovered nearly a century ago, the planet that had been classified as a death world and placed under permanent quarantine. The humans were supposed to be a primitive species, barely spacefaring, too dangerous to contact and too isolated to matter. But here was one of them, sitting across a fire from her, drawing his solar system in the dirt of a cave on a world light years from his own. He drew more. A ship, angular and ugly, its proportions wrong for atmospheric flight. He drew it approaching the 3rd planet, then breaking apart, pieces scattering across the system. He drew a smaller shape, a pod or a lander, detaching from the wreckage and falling toward the surface of a world that was not Earth. This world. Vorax. He drew the pod crashing, breaking open, and a single figure crawling out. He pointed to the figure. He pointed to himself. Varela understood. He had not been born here. He had not been abandoned by his people. He had come here by accident, his ship destroyed, his crew dead, his only shelter a crashed pod that probably did not work anymore. He had been alone on Vorax since before the Empire discovered this sector of space, surviving through sheer force of will and an adaptability that her people had never seen in any other species. She wanted to ask how long. How many years had he spent in this forest, fighting these creatures, sleeping in caves and eating raw meat and watching the stars wheel overhead without any hope of rescue? But she did not have the words. And even if she did, she was not sure she wanted to know the answer. The human wiped the drawings away with his hand and sat back. He looked at her across the fire, his expression still unreadable, but something in his eyes had changed. A guardedness, maybe. A wariness. He had shown her something true about himself, something he had probably never shown anyone else. and now he was waiting to see what she would do with the information. Varela made a decision. She reached out and picked up the charred stick. The human tensed slightly, his hand moving toward his knife, but he did not stop her. She turned to a clean patch of dirt and began to draw. She drew the empire. The 12 noble houses, their symbols arranged in a circle, the monarch's crest at the center. She drew the military, the ships and the soldiers and the weapons, the vast machinery of a civilization that spanned dozens of systems. She drew Vorax as a dot on the edge of the map, insignificant and isolated, a place that the Empire had noticed but not yet bothered to claim. Then she drew a line connecting Vorax to the human's crashed ship. She drew a circle around both of them, enclosing them together. She drew a question mark. The human studied her drawing for a long time. His hand moved away from his knife. His shoulders relaxed, just slightly. He looked at her face, then back at the drawing, then back at her face. He pointed to the question mark and raised his eyebrows. Varela touched her chest again. Varela. Then she pointed to the human, then to the question mark, then to herself. She did not have the words to explain what she was asking. She was not sure she understood it herself, but she needed him to know that she was not his enemy, that she did not come here to capture him or study him or use him for some imperial purpose, that she was here because she had seen something in the drone footage, something in the way he moved and fought and survived, something that had called to her across the darkness of the forest and would not let her rest until she understood. The human picked up the stick again. He drew a single line through the question mark, erasing it. Then he drew 2 figures standing side by side. The same image he had left on the tree trunk, the human and the alien facing the same direction. He pointed to the figures, then to himself, then to her. Varela felt something loosen in her chest, a tension she had not realized she was carrying. She nodded. Yes. Together. The human did not smile, but something in his eyes warmed just a fraction, and he leaned back against the cave wall and closed his eyes. The fire crackled. The forest whispered outside, and Varela sat across from him, watching him sleep, feeling something that might have been the beginning of trust. She stayed in the cave for 3 more days. The human came and went, hunting and gathering and checking his traps, but he always returned to the fire. He left food for her on the flat rock at the cave entrance, portions carefully divided, meat and roots and berries that she ate without question, because she had watched him eat the same things first. He showed her how to find water in the hollows of trees, how to read the direction of approaching weather by the feel of the wind on her skin, how to move through the forest without leaving a trail that anyone could follow. He did not speak, not a word, not a sound beyond the occasional grunt or exhalation. But he communicated constantly through gestures and expressions and the placement of objects. A stick laid across a path meant danger. A stone stacked on top of another stone meant water nearby. A particular pattern of scratches on a tree trunk meant that he would return to this place at this time, and she should wait for him if they became separated. Varela learned his language quickly, not because she was gifted, but because she had no choice. She needed to understand him, and he would not or could not use words. So she watched and listened and copied his gestures, and slowly, painfully, they built a shared vocabulary of grunts and hand signs and meaningful silences. On the 4th night, she asked him about the scars. She pointed to the long white line that ran from his left shoulder to his right hip, visible through the gap in his leather tunic. She raised her eyebrows, tilted her head, made her best questioning expression. The human looked down at the scar, touched it with his fingertips, and then looked back at her. For a moment, she thought he would not answer. Then he picked up the stick and drew in the dirt. A creature, large and many-limbed, its body covered in spikes. He drew it attacking, then drew himself fighting it, then drew himself falling. He drew blood, a lot of blood, spreading across the dirt in a dark stain. He drew himself lying still, the creature standing over him, and then he drew the creature turning and walking away. It left him for dead. It assumed he was dead. Or maybe it did not care either way. He had hurt it, wounded it badly enough that it did not want to risk finishing the fight. And so it had walked away and left him bleeding in the dirt. He had survived because he was too stubborn to die, or too lucky, or maybe just because the forest had not finished with him yet. Varela looked at the scar again, measuring its length, its depth, the way the tissue had healed unevenly. That wound should have killed him. Any normal creature, any normal person, would have bled out in minutes. But the human had not bled out. He had stopped the bleeding somehow, with mud or pressure or sheer force of will, and he had kept breathing until his body could begin to repair the damage. It had taken months, probably, maybe years. The scar was old, the edges smooth, the color faded. But the memory of the pain was still there, in the way he touched it, in the way his eyes went distant when he looked at the drawing. She wanted to tell him that she understood, that she had scars, too. Not on her body, but somewhere deeper, somewhere that did not show. That she had lost people she loved, watched them die, survived when they did not, and carried the guilt of that survival every day. That she had come to Vorax looking for something, some answer or some purpose, and that she had found it in the unlikeliest place imaginable. But she did not have the words, so she reached across the fire and touched his hand instead. He did not pull away. The Imperial dropship arrived on the 12th day. Varela felt it before she heard it, a vibration in the ground that did not match the rhythm of the forest. She had been tracking a herd of herbivores, following the human's instructions on reading footprints and broken vegetation, when the tremor ran through the soles of her feet and stopped her mid-stride. She knelt, pressed her palm flat against the soil, and felt the pattern resolve into something unmistakable. Engines. Heavy engines. The kind that powered military transports. The kind that did not land anywhere unless someone in command had decided that the location was worth the risk. She ran. The human was at the cave when she found him, crouched by the fire, his knife in his hand. He had felt the vibration too, or maybe he had heard something she had missed, something in the forest's constant chorus of sounds that did not belong. He looked up as she burst through the vine curtain, his eyes sharp and focused, his body already coiled for action. Varela did not have time for gestures or drawings. She grabbed his arm, pointed toward the direction of the vibration, and made a slicing motion across her throat. Danger. Coming. Now. He understood. He always understood. He stood up, kicked dirt over the fire, and followed her out of the cave. They ran together, moving through the forest at a speed that would have killed anyone without their combined conditioning. Varela's lungs burned, her legs ached, but she did not slow down. The human kept pace beside her, his breathing steady, his eyes scanning the trees for threats. He knew this forest better than she did, knew its paths and its hiding places and its killing grounds. He led her through terrain that she would have considered impassable, across streams and through thickets and under fallen logs, always moving, always pushing towards something that she could not see. They stopped at the edge of a ridge, overlooking a valley that Varela had not known existed. The dropship was there, settled in the center of a clearing, its ramp down, its interior lights spilling out into the darkness. Soldiers in full combat armor stood guard around the perimeter, their weapons raised, their sensors sweeping the tree line. Varela counted 12 of them, then 13, then 14, and stopped counting because the number did not matter. What mattered was the symbol on their shoulders, the crest of House Telnikar. Her own house, her own people. They had come for her. The human touched her arm and pointed to something at the edge of the clearing, a cage large enough to hold a person, its bars made of the same alloy that the Empire used for prisoner transports. He looked at her, his expression questioning, and Varela felt her stomach drop. They had not come for her. They had come for him. The cage was for him. The soldiers were for him. The entire operation, the dropship and the weapons and the tactical deployment, all of it was for one unarmed human living alone in a forest on a world that no one was supposed to care about. She had brought them here. Not intentionally, never intentionally, but she had filed her reports and transmitted her observations and requested her mission extension, and someone in Imperial Command had read those reports and seen something worth capturing. She had made him visible. She had painted a target on his back. And now her own people were here to take him away, to lock him in a cage and study him and use him for whatever purpose the Empire decided was appropriate. The human did not look angry. He did not look betrayed. He looked at the soldiers, at the cage, at the dropship with its imperial markings. And then he looked at her. His expression was calm, almost peaceful, the same expression he wore when he was about to kill something. He touched her arm once, briefly, and then he turned and walked down the ridge toward the clearing. Varela grabbed his arm, tried to pull him back, but he shook her off without seeming to notice. He kept walking, slow and steady, his hands at his sides, his knife tucked away. He was not attacking. He was not hiding. He was walking directly into the middle of an imperial military operation with no weapon and no armor and no plan that she could see. The soldiers saw him immediately. Their sensors had probably detected him minutes ago, had tracked his approach from the ridge to the clearing, had painted him with targeting lasers and prepared their weapons for engagement. But they did not fire. They just watched, their helmets turning to follow his progress, their hands tight on their triggers as the unarmed human walked into their perimeter and stopped 10 meters from the cage. The squad leader stepped forward, her armor marked with the insignia of a field officer. She raised her visor, revealing a face that Varela recognized, a woman she had trained with years ago before the politics of the noble houses had driven them apart. The officer looked at the human, then at the ridge where Varela was still hiding, then back at the human. She spoke, her voice amplified by her helmet speaker, carrying across the clearing. By order of the Imperial Council and the authority of House Telnikar, you are commanded to submit to detention and transport. You will not be harmed if you comply. The human did not move. He stood with his feet shoulder-width apart, his hands loose at his sides, his head slightly tilted. He looked like he was listening to something, some sound that the soldiers could not hear, some signal from the forest that only he could detect. The officer repeated the command, her voice harder this time. Submit to detention. This is your final warning. The human turned his head slightly, looking past the soldiers, looking directly at the ridge where Varela was hiding. Their eyes met across the distance, and something passed between them, some understanding that did not need words. He was not going to submit. He was not going to go with them. He was going to do what he always did when something threatened his territory. He was going to fight. He moved so fast that Varela almost missed it. One moment he was standing still, his hands at his sides, his posture relaxed. The next moment he was inside the soldier's perimeter, his knife in his hand, his body a blur of motion that the Imperial sensors could not track. He did not strike to kill. He struck to disable, his blade cutting through armor joints and weapon housings and communication cables, leaving soldiers screaming and sparking and falling to the ground. He moved through them like smoke, like water, like something that had no physical form, and by the time the officer raised her weapon to fire, he was already behind her. He took her down with a single blow to the back of her knee, dropping her to the ground, and then he was gone, vanished into the darkness of the forest, leaving behind a clearing full of broken soldiers and a cage that would never hold him. Varela watched him go, her heart pounding, her hands shaking. She had seen him fight before, had watched him kill the hexapod and the megafauna and the other creatures that called this forest home. But this was different. These were not animals. These were soldiers, trained and armed and armored, representatives of the most powerful military force in the sector. And he had dismantled them like they were nothing, like they were children playing at war, like their technology and their training and their weapons were just toys that he could break with his bare hands. She should have been afraid. She should have been horrified. Instead, she felt something warm spreading through her chest, something that might have been pride or admiration or something else entirely. She had chosen correctly. She had chosen him, and he had proven that her choice was right. She ran after him into the darkness. The human did not speak for a long time after that night. He withdrew into himself, his gestures becoming sharper, his silences deeper. He checked his traps obsessively, walked his perimeter constantly, slept in short bursts with his knife in his hand. The soldiers had not come back, but they would. Varela knew it, and he knew it. And the knowledge hung between them like a physical weight. She gave him space. She did not follow him when he left the cave. She did not ask questions when he returned with blood on his hands and exhaustion in his eyes. She simply stayed nearby, available but not intrusive, ready to help if he needed her, but content to wait if he did not. She had learned that about him in the weeks they had spent together. He did not respond well to pressure. He needed time to process, to think, to come to his own conclusions. On the 5th night after the dropship, he came back to the cave with something in his hands. A piece of wood, smooth and polished, carved with symbols that Varela did not recognize. He held it out to her, and she took it, turning it over in her hands. The symbols were arranged in a pattern, swirling lines and angular shapes that reminded her of something she had seen in the Imperial archives, something about ancient human writing systems. She looked up at him, questioning. He pointed to the symbols, then to himself, then to the sky. His name. His name was written here, in the language of his ancestors, in the script of a world he would probably never see again. Varela traced the symbols with her fingertip, feeling the grooves where the knife had cut into the wood. She tried to pronounce them, to shape her mouth around sounds that did not exist in her language, but the human shook his head and smiled. Not like that. Not with your voice, with your heart. She did not understand what he meant, but she held the wood close to her chest, and she nodded. and she promised herself that she would learn to read his name the way he wanted her to read it. He sat down across the fire from her and picked up the stick. He drew in the dirt, slowly and carefully, constructing an image that took her several minutes to recognize. It was a map. Not of the forest or the cave or the surrounding territory, but of something larger, something that spanned continents and oceans and the blackness between stars. He drew the empire as a cluster of dots, connected by lines that represented trade routes and military patrols and political alliances. He drew Vorax as a dot at the edge of the cluster, isolated and insignificant. And then he drew Earth, far away on the other side of the map, alone in the darkness. He pointed to Earth. He pointed to himself. He pointed to the Empire. He drew a line connecting all three, and then he drew a question mark. What happens now? Varela looked at the map, at the dots and lines and symbols, and felt the weight of the question pressing down on her. She did not know what happened now. The Empire had tried to take him once, and he had fought them off, but they would try again. They would send more soldiers, better weapons, more advanced technology. They would not stop until they had him, or until he was dead, or until something changed that she could not predict. She picked up the stick and drew her own image. A door opening. A path leading away from the forest, away from Vorax, away from everything he had ever known. She drew him walking through the door, and she drew herself walking beside him. Together. He looked at the drawing for a long time. Then he wiped it away and drew something else. A forest, vast and dark, stretching to the horizon. A figure standing alone in the middle of it, small and insignificant against the immensity of the trees. The figure was facing away from the viewer, looking out at something that the drawing did not show. He pointed to the figure. He pointed to himself. He was not ready to leave. He might never be ready. The forest was the only home he had known for longer than he could remember, the only place where he understood the rules and could predict the dangers. The Empire was chaos, uncertainty, 1,000 variables that he could not control. He would stay here, in the darkness, where he knew how to survive. Varela wanted to argue. She wanted to tell him that he could not stay here forever, that the Empire would keep coming, that eventually they would bring enough force to overwhelm even him. But she looked at his face, at the set of his jaw and the darkness in his eyes, and she understood that this was not a debate. This was a statement. He had made his decision, and he would not change it. She put down the stick and reached across the fire to touch his hand. He let her, as he always did, and she felt the warmth of his skin against her fingers. She did not have the words to tell him what she was feeling, the strange mixture of respect and frustration and something deeper that she was afraid to name. So she just sat with him in the silence, watching the fire burn down to embers and the stars wheel overhead. In the morning, she made her own decision. She would not leave him. She could not leave him. The Empire had its orders and its plans and its cages, but she had something else. She had a choice, and she chose him. The days turned into weeks, and the weeks turned into months. Varela stopped counting. The forest became her home, the cave her shelter, the human her constant companion. She learned his language of gestures and silences, learned to read his moods in the set of his shoulders and the angle of his head. She learned to hunt beside him, to move through the trees without sound, to read the signs that the forest left for those who knew how to look. She learned his name. It happened on a night like any other, the fire crackling between them, the darkness pressing close against the cave entrance. He was carving something, a piece of wood that would become another tool or another weapon or another piece of the silent vocabulary they had built together. She was watching him work, her eyes tracing the movement of his hands, the way his fingers gripped the knife and shaped the wood. He looked up at her, and for a moment, something shifted in his expression. The guardedness dropped away, replaced by something raw and vulnerable that she had never seen before. He opened his mouth, and she thought he was going to yawn or cough or make some other meaningless sound. But then he spoke. Kalen. The word was soft, almost a whisper, barely audible over the crackle of the fire. His voice was rough from disuse, the vowels flat, the consonants clipped, but she understood him. She understood him perfectly. Kalen, his name. The first word he had spoken in her presence, the first sound he had made that was not a grunt or an exhalation. He had chosen to give her his name, to share that piece of himself, and the weight of the gift pressed against her chest, like a physical thing. She repeated it, shaping her mouth around the sounds, trying to match the way he had said it. Kalen. The word felt strange on her tongue, foreign and familiar at the same time. It tasted like smoke and wood and something else, something she could not identify. He nodded once, and then looked back down at his carving. But she saw the corner of his mouth twitch, just slightly, in something that might have been a smile. And she felt something shift inside her, something that had been building since the first moment she saw him in the drone footage, since the first night she watched him sleep by the fire, since the first time he touched her hand and did not pull away. She was in love with him. The realization hit her like a physical blow, stealing her breath and making her heart stutter. She had not come to Vorax looking for love. She had come looking for answers, for understanding, for something to fill the emptiness that had been growing inside her for years. She had found him instead, a scarred and silent human living alone in a dark forest, fighting creatures that would kill anyone else, surviving through sheer force of will. He was broken and beautiful and terrifying, and she loved him. She did not say anything. She did not know how. The words would not come, would not form themselves into sounds that made sense. So she just sat with him, across the fire, watching the light play across his face, and she held the knowledge close to her heart, like a secret she was not ready to share. The Empire came back on the first day of the rainy season. Varela heard the dropship hours before it landed, the distant rumble of engines growing louder as the vessel descended through the atmosphere. She was alone in the cave when she heard it, Kalen out checking his traps, and she felt a cold knot of fear form in her stomach. They had not come for her last time. They had come for him, and this time, they would not send a small squad with a single cage. This time, they would send everything they had. She ran. The rain was already starting to fall, thin and cold, turning the forest floor to mud and making the trees slick and treacherous. She slipped twice, catching herself on roots and branches, pushing herself faster, harder, ignoring the pain in her legs and the burning in her lungs. She had to find him. She had to warn him. She had to do something, anything, to keep them from taking him away. She found him at the edge of the ridge, the same ridge where they had watched the first dropship land. He was standing at the edge of the tree line, looking down at the valley below, his body still and his face blank. She followed his gaze and felt her heart stop. The valley was full of ships, not just one dropship this time, dozens of them, lined up in neat rows, their ramps down and their engines humming. Soldiers in heavy combat armor moved between them, carrying equipment and setting up perimeter defenses and preparing for something that Varela did not want to imagine. She counted 3 heavy transports, 4 assault craft, and at least 100 soldiers. Maybe more. It was hard to tell from this distance, through the rain and the darkness and the tears that were starting to blur her vision. They were going to take him. They were going to march into the forest with their weapons and their sensors and their overwhelming force, and they were going to take him, and there was nothing she could do to stop them. Kaylin touched her arm. She turned to look at him, and she saw that his face was not blank. His face was calm, almost peaceful, the same expression he wore when he was about to do something dangerous. He looked at the ships, at the soldiers, at the cage that was already being assembled at the center of the camp. And then he looked at her. He pointed to the forest. He pointed to himself. He pointed to the ships, and then he drew his thumb across his throat. He was not going to run. He was going to fight. He was going to do what he always did when something threatened his home. He was going to stand his ground. Varela grabbed his arm, tried to pull him back, tried to make him understand that this was different. 100 soldiers, dozens of ships, weapons and technology and tactics that he had never seen before. He could not fight them all. He could not win. He looked at her hand on his arm, and then he looked at her face. His expression softened, just slightly, and he reached up to touch her cheek with his fingertips. His skin was warm against hers, even in the cold rain, and she felt something break inside her. He turned and walked down the ridge toward the ships. She followed him. The battle lasted 6 hours. Varela watched from the tree line as Kalin moved through the Imperial camp like a ghost, like a shadow, like something that did not exist. He used the rain to mask his sound, the darkness to hide his movement, the chaos of the soldiers' own preparations to cover his approach. He struck without warning, without mercy, without any sign that he was there until the bodies started falling. He did not kill them. That was the strangest part, the part that Varela could not understand. He could have killed them. He had the skill, the speed, the strength. Every blow he struck could have been fatal. Every knife thrust could have found a throat or a heart or an artery. But he held back. He struck to disable, to wound, to take soldiers out of the fight without ending their lives. He broke weapons and shattered armor joints and cut communication cables, and when the soldiers fell, they fell alive. The camp descended into chaos. Soldiers fired blindly into the darkness, their weapons leaving trails of plasma that illuminated nothing and everything. They shouted warnings and commands and prayers, their voices overlapping into a wall of sound that told Varela everything she needed to know about their morale. They were afraid. They were so afraid, and their fear was making them stupid, making them slow, making them miss the shadow that moved among them with the patience of something that had been hunting for longer than any of them had been alive. Kaylin took down the commander first. He emerged from the darkness behind the command tent, his knife flashing once, and the officer crumpled with her throat intact, but her armor disabled. Then he moved to the weapons depot, slashing through power cables and fuel lines, turning the camp's own supplies into a maze of hazards that the soldiers could not navigate. Then he went for the cage, dismantling its locking mechanism with a few quick twists of his knife, rendering it useless before anyone could think to put him inside it. By the 4th hour, half the soldiers were incapacitated. By the 5th hour, the rest had stopped trying to fight and started trying to survive. They huddled behind their transports, firing blindly into the darkness, praying to gods that Varela was pretty sure had never listened to anyone from the Empire. And Colin moved among them, patient and relentless, taking them down one by one. Varela did not help him. She could not. Her hands were shaking too badly, her legs too weak, her mind too full of images that she would never be able to forget. She just watched, from the safety of the tree line, as the man she loved dismantled an entire imperial military operation with nothing but a bone knife and a willingness to do whatever it took to protect what was his. The sun was starting to rise when the last soldier fell. Kalen stood in the center of the camp, surrounded by bodies and broken equipment and the wreckage of 100 imperial dreams. His chest was heaving, his arms streaked with blood that was not his own, his face blank with exhaustion. He looked at the rising sun, at the forest, at the ships that still hummed with power but had no one left to crew them. And then he looked at Varela. He walked toward her, slow and steady, his feet leaving prints in the mud. She wanted to run to him, to throw her arms around him, to hold him and never let go. But her legs would not move. She just stood there, frozen, as he crossed the distance between them and stopped to arm's length away. He looked at her for a long moment. His eyes were dark and tired, shadowed by something that might have been grief or relief or simply the weight of another night survived. He opened his mouth, and she thought he was going to speak, going to say something that would explain everything or nothing or something in between. Instead, he reached out and took her hand. His fingers laced through hers, warm and strong and surprisingly gentle. He held on, not tight enough to hurt, just tight enough to let her know that he was there, that he was real, that he had survived again and would keep surviving as long as she was there beside him. Varela looked down at their joined hands, at the contrast between her blue skin and his brown, at the way their fingers fit together like they had been made for each other. And she felt something inside her settle, something that had been restless and searching for as long as she could remember. She was home, not the empire, not the noble houses, not the floating spires of Telnikar. Here, in this dark forest, with this silent human, standing in the rain and the mud and the aftermath of violence that should have been impossible. She squeezed his hand. He squeezed back. Together, they walked into the forest. The Empire did not come back. Varela did not know why, and she did not care. Maybe the reports from the failed operation had convinced Imperial Command that Vorax was not worth the cost. Maybe the political fallout from losing an entire company to a single unarmed human had been too severe to risk another attempt. Maybe the Queen herself had looked at the telemetry and made a decision that no one else understood. Whatever the reason, the forest was quiet. The ships stopped coming. The soldiers stopped searching. The surveillance drones stopped flying. And Kalen went back to his routines, hunting and trapping and patrolling the perimeter, as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. Varela saw it in the way he moved, the way he looked at her, the way he sometimes reached out to touch her hand or her shoulder or her face for no reason other than to feel her skin against his. He was no longer alone. He had been alone for so long, so many years, surviving but not living, existing but not thriving. Now he had her, and she had him, and together they were something more than either of them could have been apart. She taught him her language. It was slow, frustrating work, her tongue stumbling over the shapes of words that she had spoken since childhood, his mind struggling to process sounds that did not exist in any human language. But he learned. He was always learning, always adapting, always finding ways to do things that should have been impossible. Within a month, he could understand most of what she said. Within 2 months, he could respond, his voice rough and his accent thick, but the words were there. Within 3 months, he told her that he loved her. They were sitting by the fire in the same cave where they had spent so many nights. The rain was falling outside, soft and steady, filling the darkness with a sound that Varela had come to find comforting. Colin was carving something, his hands moving automatically, his eyes focused on the wood. She was watching him, as she always watched him, trying to memorize the lines of his face, the way the firelight played across his scars. He looked up at her, and she saw something in his eyes that she had never seen before. Not guardedness, not wariness, not the constant alertness that came from years of surviving alone. Something softer, something warmer, something that looked almost like peace. "I love you," he said. The words were clumsy, the vowels wrong, the consonants soft where they should have been hard. But she understood him. She understood him perfectly. She opened her mouth to respond, to tell him that she loved him too, that she had loved him from the first moment she saw him in the drone footage, that she would love him until the stars burned out and the universe grew cold. But the words would not come. They were too small, too weak, too inadequate for what she was feeling. So she leaned across the fire and kissed him instead. His lips were warm and soft, tasting of smoke and rain and something else that she could not identify. He did not pull away. He did not tense up or freeze or react with anything other than acceptance. He kissed her back, his hand coming up to cup the back of her head, his fingers tangling in her hair. And for a long moment, there was nothing else in the universe, just the fire and the rain and the two of them together, finally. They did not speak after that. There was nothing left to say. They sat together by the fire, her head on his shoulder, his arm around her waist, watching the flames dance and the sparks rise and the darkness press against the cave entrance. And Varela let herself feel something she had not felt in years. She let herself be happy. The years passed. The forest changed with the seasons, the black trees shedding their leaves and growing new ones, the streams swelling with rain and shrinking with drought, the creatures living and dying in cycles that Varela learned to predict. She grew older, her hair fading from deep blue to silver, her skin wrinkling at the corners of her eyes and mouth. Kalin grew older too, his scars fading to pale lines, his hair thinning, his movements slowing from the blur of his youth to something more deliberate, more careful. They built a home together. Not the cave, which they still used as a shelter in the worst of the weather, but a structure of wood and stone at the edge of a clearing, with a real roof and real walls and a door that closed against the cold. Kalin built most of it, his hands as skilled at construction as they were at combat. But Varela helped, carrying stones and cutting wood and learning skills she had never needed in the imperial military. They had children. 2 of them, a boy and a girl, born in the depth of winter with the fire roaring and Colin's hands steady and Varela's screams echoing off the cave walls. The children were beautiful, their skin a strange mix of blue and brown, their eyes dark like their father's, their hair curling like their mother's. They grew up in the forest, learning to hunt and track and survive, learning their father's language of silences and their mother's language of words, learning to be something that had never existed before. The Empire did not forget them. Varela knew this because sometimes, on clear nights, she could see the lights of ships in the upper atmosphere, watching and waiting. They never landed. They never sent soldiers or drones or cages. They just watched, content to observe from a distance, to collect data and file reports, and leave the forest to its strange inhabitants. The Queen herself came once, near the end. Her ship landed in the same valley where the military operation had failed so many years before, and she walked alone to the edge of the forest, unarmed and unarmored, her white robes trailing in the mud. She stood at the tree line and waited, patient and still, until Kylan emerged from the darkness. They spoke for a long time. Varela did not hear what they said, did not want to hear. She stayed in the clearing with the children, watching the sun set and the stars emerge, waiting for Kylan to come back to her. He came back at midnight, his face unreadable, his hands empty. He sat down beside her by the fire and took her hand, and they watched the flames together in silence. What did she want? Varela asked eventually. Kylan was quiet for a long moment. She wanted to know if I was happy, he said, if I regretted staying here, if I would have chosen differently, knowing what I know now. And what did you tell her? He looked at her then, really looked at her, his dark eyes tracing the lines of her face, the silver in her hair, the wrinkles around her mouth. I told her the truth, he said, that I have never been happier, that I have never regretted a single moment, that I would make the same choice 1,000 times if I had to. Varela felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. She blinked them back, not wanting to cry, not wanting to break the fragile peace of the moment. But Colin saw them anyway. He always saw everything. He leaned over and kissed her forehead, soft and gentle, his lips lingering against her skin. I love you, he said. I have loved you since the first moment I saw you in the trees, trying so hard to be silent, trying so hard to hide. I knew then that you were different, that you were worth trusting, that you were worth everything. Varela closed her eyes and leaned into him, feeling the warmth of his body against hers, the steadiness of his heartbeat, the strength of his arms around her. She had come to Vorax looking for something, some answer or some purpose, some reason to keep going when everything felt empty and meaningless. She had found him instead. A scarred and silent human, living alone in a dark forest, fighting creatures that should have killed him 100 times over. He was broken and beautiful and terrifying, and he was hers. She opened her eyes and looked up at the stars, at the distant lights of the ships that still watched from above, at the vast and indifferent universe that had brought them together against all odds. And she smiled. She was home.